Okay, what I'm doing here is we're going to call this uh, Part 1A of the 1920s Red Scare because there's something that I passed over, and I thought it would be easier just to fit this in between parts 1 and 2 rather than try to patch it back on later, because we're looking at stuff that had people riled up and rattled in 1919 and a bit beyond. Now, we've seen that to join it up to where we just were. Returning veterans, um, quite a few of them were not able to get their jobs back, partly because the economy was collapsing into a deep recession, and partly because while they were gone, America had changed in a surprisingly short time. Okay? There were ethnic prejudices, race prejudices, etc., that had just gone unquestioned for a very long time. But employers, with just the way things were and the labor market going down, as 4.5 million men went in the military while the demand for labor increased greatly. They just got to find somebody to hire. They're hiring people they would not have even thought about hiring previously. This is going to be certain despised minorities, certain ethnic groups, black workers, some women, though not on the scale of World War II. And this gives these people a chance to prove themselves that they're good and reliable workers. And employers usually would let them go once the war is over and demand for labor falls, but not always, because some of these people they want to keep them around because really good employees are hard to find. And that was true then as it is now. So anyway, that greatly frustrated black veterans who, let's just admit, we've never been perfect. They accepted without question, the prejudices of the culture of their generation, as perhaps we accept the prejudices of our own. Okay, we'll leave that one alone. Now, here's what I wanted to insert. There's a really nasty race prejudice component to this. To begin with, African Americans had supported the war enthusiastically. They saw in it an opportunity to prove themselves as their loyalty, their bravery, their patriotism, and hopefully win a more respected place in American life. So around 500,000 African American men served in the military during World War I. And that's over 10% of the total number of men who served. Well, so they put on the uniform, they went through training, they accepted with surprising patience. It's not 100%, but it's surprising still. Being assigned to segregated units commanded by white officers and relegated to menial tasks like digging ditches, driving trucks, loading and unloading trucks, um, shoveling out latrines, that kind of thing. But military training gave them a sense of self confidence and self assurance that they'd never had before. Plus, those who were deployed to France, they encounter French people, and for whatever their faults may be, the French have never been particularly racially prejudiced. So these African American men have experienced life away from Southern customs, and when they get home, they're not they're not planning on going back to smiling and shuffling and saying yes, I like they used to. Well, obviously this is not going to be greeted well. Now, lynchings spiked. There were 76 lynchings in 1919, as far as anybody can discern. That's the highest number in 15 years. And contrary to popular belief, not all lynching victims were black. They're disproportionately black. It might have even been a majority, but it's not all black. The lynchings happen, as I think I'm going to there's going to be a second part of this you probably won't see when it changes, but lynch mobs uh, have no confidence that the normal judicial processes are going to get it right, and they take the law into their own hands. Now, Among the lynching victims are black veterans, some of whom were lynched wearing the uniform of their country. Now, that should nauseate you. But when people are nervous enough and jittery enough and worried about change, and I think it's change more than it is just blatant seething race hate that triggers this. You got some of that. I don't think there's as much as people assume there was, but just the sight of a black man exhibiting confidence, wearing a military uniform, that's enough to trigger a violent response in some people. So there were also race riots, mostly not in the South. In fact, generally they weren't. One of the dirty little secrets of Tulsa, Oklahoma, is that there were really nasty race riots where several people were killed in about, I forget if it was 1920 or 22, but that happened. There was a race riot in Omaha, Nebraska. There was one in Chicago that lasted nearly a week that left 24 white people dead, 39 black people dead, and several thousand people homeless because of buildings had been destroyed. So these race riots are happening outside the South, largely in areas where there had not been very many black people before, and now they're starting to move in the migration out of the Old South. And let's just say the white population does not always receive them with open arms. And again, on the one hand, there is racial prejudice, no doubt about that. Whether it's just burning race hate, we don't know. I tend to doubt it. I think it's people, better explanation is people just reacting against change when they're nervous about change. So it's easy to attribute this to some kind of ongoing, just seething, burning, smoldering race hate. And certainly that kind of thing exists in some quarters, but I'm not sure how widespread it was. I think people were nervous about change. They're going to respond negatively to anything that looks like unwelcome social change or cultural change. That probably explains the explosion there. Now, the 1920s would go on to be yet another decade when it was tough to be black in America. The main events along that line are the continuing flight of African Americans out of the Deep South into the big northern cities, Chicago, New York City, etc. New York, particularly, you begin to see the emergence of a black urban culture, and certain cultural changes that affect all of society are carried north with this migration. In New York City, the Northerners were not really any less racist than the Southerners were at the time, but the advantage of a big city is you can kind of lose yourself. It's not as focused as it would be in a rural area or a small town in the South. So African Americans could live in a northern city if they could find some place that let them live there, and not really run into anything potentially as vicious as they would in the South. In New York City, there was an area, a neighborhood, shall we say, that had once been very opulent and upscale. It was called Harlem. By the 1920s, it's fallen on hard times. Once magnificent apartments had sort of gone seedy, and the property owners realized that they could rent the properties to black tenants who would have no choice but to pay what they were charged because nobody else would let them in. And so Harlem became heavily associated with the black urban culture in New York City. And somewhat similar things would happen elsewhere. It still is today. There was the impact of what is called jazz music, carried north from New Orleans to mainly the Chicago area and then New York City, and it became the cultural phenomenon of the 20s. Jazz music, as a popular music style, supplanted ragtime, which was upbeat, highly syncopated piano music, also the product of black musicians from a slightly earlier time. And wealthy white patrons would just crowd out nightclubs and so forth where jazz musicians were playing. In literature, there was something called the Harlem Renaissance. There were black writers and poets, prominently Langston Hughes and Claude McKay, who found wide audiences. They had white patrons, keeping them going. That's somebody who subsidizes their efforts. Some suspect that if they'd actually written down what they were really thinking, they might have had a little bit more trouble getting financial support. Okay. There was a black separatist movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, headed by a man named Langston Hughes, who liked to dress up like a like a banana republic dictator, and his association happened to own a steamship line. And their idea was that the future for black people lay in a return to Africa. The return part would be kind of odd because black Americans were descended from Africans who were brought several generations earlier and had no particular personal connection with Africa, except that's where their ancestors came from. The steamship line could be used to take these African Americans back to Africa. The Ku Klux Klan, which was enjoying a burst of popularity about that time, approved of this. The Universal Negro Improvement Association and the Ku Klux Klan exchanged encouragements. But anyway, the leader of it got in trouble. He was accused of fraud, and I'm not 100% sure I believe he was really guilty of anything, but that put that out of business. So there we go. And serious advances for African Americans would have to wait another generation or two. Okay, that'll do it for this part of a part. It went longer than I thought.